You're in a meeting and someone takes credit for your work. You feel the heat rise in your chest, the sentence forming in your throat, and then you let it pass. You tell yourself it's not worth it, that bringing it up would make things awkward, that maybe they didn't mean it that way. Later, at dinner, your partner makes the same dismissive comment they've made a dozen times before. The one that suggests you're overreacting, that you're too sensitive, that you make small things into big deals. You feel the familiar tightness. You think about saying something real this time, and then you smile. You change the subject. You let it go. On the drive home, you replay both moments. You write better versions in your head. The things you should have said, the words that would have landed cleanly, the way you could have stood your ground without being aggressive. You practice conversations that will never happen. And by the time you walk through the door, you've convinced yourself that silence was the mature choice, that you're just someone who doesn't need to make everything into a confrontation, that this is what it means to be reasonable. There's a feeling you can't quite name, a small, consistent weight that doesn't announce itself but never fully leaves. It sits somewhere behind your ribs. It surfaces when you're alone, and it feels like something you're carrying that no one else can see. Avoiding conflict works. That's the part people skip over when they talk about this pattern. It works because it keeps things smooth. It preserves the surface. It means you don't have to sit in the discomfort of someone being upset with you, or worse, disappointed. It means you don't risk being seen as difficult, combative, or too much. When you stay quiet, people stay comfortable. When you don't push back, you don't become the problem. There's a kind of safety in that, a predictability. You know what happens when you keep the peace, you don't always know what happens when you break it. And in some relationships, avoiding conflict is what keeps you included. Speaking up might mean being excluded, misunderstood, or labeled as a person who always has an issue. So you adapt. You learn to soften your edges, to swallow the smaller irritations, to let things slide because addressing them feels riskier than enduring them. This isn't weakness, it's strategy. It's a pattern you develop because at some point it protected you. Maybe in your family, conflict meant chaos. Maybe it meant silence for days. Maybe it meant being told you were too sensitive, too intense, too difficult to deal with. So you learned not to be those things. You learned to be easy, flexible, low maintenance. And for a while, that works beautifully. People tell you they appreciate how reasonable you are, how you don't make a big deal out of things, how you're so understanding, so mature, so unlike the people who always seem to need drama or validation. You wear that as proof that you're doing something right, that you've figured out how to navigate the world without friction, that you've transcended the need to assert yourself at every turn. And there's real relief in that, real comfort. Because conflict is exhausting. It requires vulnerability. It means sitting in tension without knowing how it will resolve. It means risking that the other person won't hear you, won't care, or will use what you've said against you later. So yes, avoiding it works. It keeps the machinery running. It keeps relationships moving forward. It keeps you from being the squeaky wheel that everyone secretly resents. Until it doesn't. But here's the trade you made without announcing it. You get to avoid the immediate discomfort of confrontation, and in exchange, you live with a constant low-grade discomfort that never fully resolves. You don't have to deal with someone being angry at you in the moment, but you do have to deal with your own resentment building quietly over months and years. You don't have to risk being seen as difficult, but you do have to accept being treated as if your boundaries don't exist. You get to keep relationships intact, but the version of you in those relationships becomes less and less accurate. The cost isn't dramatic. It doesn't show up as a single catastrophic event. It shows up as a constant background hum, a small erosion, a version of yourself that you keep editing down to fit into spaces that were never asked to make room for you. You stop saying what you actually think. You start saying what keeps things moving. And over time, the gap between those two things becomes so familiar you stop noticing it's there. Until someone asks you a direct question. What do you actually want? And you realize you've been answering that question in relation to everyone else for so long that you no longer have a clean answer. The trade happens in increments, small enough that each one seems reasonable. You let a comment slide at Thanksgiving because you don't want to ruin the day. You don't correct your boss when they misrepresent what you said in the meeting because it's not worth the political fallout. You agree to plans you don't actually want because saying no feels harder than just going along. And each time you tell yourself it's fine, it's one thing, it's not a pattern. But it is. And the pattern has a cost that compounds quietly, the way interest does, the way small debts become unmanageable when you stop paying attention to them. The cost of avoiding conflict isn't just that you don't get what you want, it's that you stop knowing what you want clearly enough to ask for it. When you spend years not voicing your actual thoughts, your internal compass starts to drift. You lose access to your own preferences because you've trained yourself not to prioritize them. You become so practiced at adjusting to what others need that your own needs become background noise. And then one day you're in a conversation where someone asks your opinion and you hesitate. Not because you don't have one, but because you've become so used to gauging the room first that offering a real answer feels almost reckless. You've learned to read the room before you read yourself. And after enough years of that, the signal from yourself gets weaker, harder to detect, easier to dismiss. The other cost is respect. And this one's harder to admit. When you consistently avoid conflict, people stop seeing you as someone with firm boundaries. They start seeing you as someone who can be managed. Not because they're malicious, but because you've taught them that your limits are negotiable. That if they push just a little, you'll give way. And once that pattern is established, it's difficult to reverse. Because when you finally do push back, it doesn't land as boundaries being set, it lands as you suddenly being unreasonable, as a departure from who you've always been. You become the inconsistent one, even though you were just finally consistent with yourself. There's another cost that lives in your body. The tension you don't express doesn't dissolve. It doesn't evaporate just because you decided not to voice it. It settles in your shoulders, your jaw, your stomach. It becomes the headache you can't explain, the fatigue that doesn't match your activity level, the insomnia that arises without obvious cause. Your body keeps score even when you're not consciously counting. And over time, you start to notice that you're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, that you're holding yourself in a way that requires constant effort, that relaxing, truly relaxing, feels almost impossible because some part of you is always braced for the next thing you'll need to absorb without reacting to. And this is rarely the only place the cost shows up. It tends to follow you into other roles, other relationships, other moments where the same trade keeps being made. At work, you don't challenge the idea that makes no sense, so you end up executing a plan you knew wouldn't work. At home, you don't name the imbalance, so you become the one who quietly picks up what others leave behind. In friendships, you don't say when something hurt you, so the same dynamic repeats until the relationship feels hollow. You're not doing this because you're weak, you're doing it because the alternative feels too costly in the moment. But the moments accumulate, and the version of you that people know becomes the version that never disrupts anything, the one who absorbs tension rather than addressing it. And here's the part that's difficult to sit with. You're participating in this, not because you're broken or damaged, but because on some level, this still feels safer than the alternative. Conflict feels like risk. Silence feels like control. Except it's not control. It's a delay. The thing you're avoiding doesn't dissolve. It just finds another place to live. In your body, in your sleep, in the quiet moments when you're alone and the performance drops. You think you're keeping the peace, but what you're actually doing is keeping the cost to yourself. There's a specific moment when this becomes visible, when the math stops adding up. You're doing everything right. You're being reasonable. You're not making demands. You're not creating drama. You're being the person everyone says you want to be. And yet, you're exhausted. You're resentful. You're lonely in rooms full of people who supposedly care about you. And you start to realize that the problem isn't that you're doing it wrong. The problem is that the entire framework is built on a premise that doesn't hold, that your silence is neutral, that your flexibility costs you nothing, that accommodation is the same as connection. But it's not. Accommodation is what you do when you're trying to earn your place. Connection is what happens when both people are allowed to take up space.
and you've been accommodating for so long that you've forgotten what connection without performance feels like.
There's a version of this pattern that becomes particularly clear in long-term relationships. You've been with someone for years. You've avoided 1,000 small conflicts. You've let things go because they seemed minor at the time, because bringing them up felt petty, because you didn't want to be the person who makes everything difficult. And then one day, something small happens, something objectively minor, and you feel a disproportionate surge of anger, the kind that doesn't match the situation. And you know, somewhere inside, that this isn't really about the dishes or the comment or the forgotten errand. It's about all the other times, the ones you didn't address, the ones that stacked quietly in a part of you that you don't show. And now you're faced with a choice. Do you bring up this one small thing and risk sounding irrational? Or do you let this one go too and add it to the pile? Either way, you lose, because the real conversation, the one about the pattern, is so far back now that it feels impossible to access without sounding like you've been keeping score. Which, in a way, you have. You just weren't aware you were doing it. This is what happens when you avoid conflict for long enough. The conflicts don't disappear, they accumulate. They become a backlog of unspoken truths that you carry around, waiting for the right moment to address them. Except the right moment never comes, because the right moment would have been the first time, or the second, or any of the dozen times before the pattern became entrenched. Now, bringing it up feels like you're changing the rules, like you're suddenly demanding something you never cared about before. Even though you always cared, you just didn't say so. And the person across from you has no context for this. To them, everything was fine. You never said it wasn't, you smiled, you went along, you gave every indication that this was working. So when you finally break, when the cost becomes unbearable and you try to name it, it lands like an ambush. Like you've been harboring resentment this whole time and never gave them a chance to adjust. And in some ways, that's accurate. You were harboring it. You just didn't call it that. You called it being understanding, being patient, being the bigger person. But resentment doesn't care what you call it. It builds regardless. The cost that's hardest to name is what happens to your sense of self. When you avoid conflict consistently, you start to believe that the version of you that doesn't make waves is the real version, the acceptable one, the one people can tolerate. And the parts of you that have sharper edges, that have strong reactions, that don't find certain things acceptable, those parts start to feel like liabilities, like things you need to manage or suppress. So you do. You manage them. You become very good at it. But those parts don't disappear. They just go underground. And what replaces them on the surface is a kind of practice pleasantness that starts to feel automatic. You become someone who reflexively smooths things over, who minimizes their own discomfort, who can't quite access anger even when it would be appropriate. And then one day, you're in a situation that genuinely calls for pushback, something that crosses a line, something that shouldn't be tolerated, and you find that you can't access the response you need. Not because you don't feel it, but because you've spent so long training yourself not to express it that the pathway has atrophied. You've become so good at not causing problems that you can't defend yourself when it matters. And that's when the loss becomes undeniable. Because it's not just about external relationships anymore. It's about the relationship you have with yourself, the trust you've eroded by repeatedly signaling to yourself that your discomfort is less important than someone else's ease. Every time you swallow what you actually think, you're making a small deposit into a belief that your perspective isn't worth the disruption it might cause, that you're only acceptable when you're not asking for anything. And after enough deposits, that belief becomes weight bearing. It becomes the foundation for how you move through the world. You start to notice it in small ways first. Someone asks what you want for dinner, and you genuinely don't know. Not because you don't have preferences, but because you've spent so long deferring that accessing your own preference feels like an act of excavation. Someone asks if you're upset, and you say no automatically before you've even checked, because the script is written, the role is clear. You're the one who doesn't get upset. You're the one who understands. Except you are upset. You're just so practiced at not showing it that even you can't tell anymore.
This is the deepest cost, the one that doesn't show up in your relationships with others, but in your relationship with yourself. You stop trusting your own reactions because you've overridden them so many times that you're no longer sure which ones are real and which ones are just you being difficult or too sensitive or making a big deal out of nothing. You start to doubt yourself in moments where you should be certain, where your gut is giving you clear information and you ignore it because you've learned not to trust that signal. And over time, that doubt becomes your baseline. You move through the world in a state of constant second guessing, not about facts or logistics, but about your own emotional reality. Did that comment actually bother you, or are you overreacting? Is that boundary reasonable, or are you being rigid? Is this worth bringing up, or are you just looking for conflict? And because you can't trust your own read, you default to silence, which reinforces the pattern, which deepens the doubt. There's a story you've been telling yourself about this pattern, a few of them actually. One of them is, I'm just someone who doesn't need conflict. I'm easygoing. I don't sweat the small stuff. But if you're honest, you do sweat the small stuff. You just do it alone later, in your head, where no one else has to deal with it. So it's not that you're unbothered, it's that you've made your discomfort private. Another story, people appreciate that I'm low maintenance. It's one of my strengths. But is that true? Or have people just gotten used to not having to consider you? There's a difference between being appreciated and being convenient. And once you see that difference, it becomes harder to tell yourself that what you're receiving is respect. And maybe the hardest one, this is just who I am. I've always been this way. Except that's not quite accurate either, because there was a time, maybe a long time ago, when you did speak up, when you did push back, and something happened that taught you not to. Maybe you were told you were too much, maybe you were punished for it. Maybe you just learned that keeping quiet made things easier for everyone, including you. So this isn't who you are, this is who you became in response to something. And the belief that it's fixed, unchangeable, just your personality, is the final layer of protection. Because if this is just who you are, then you don't have to sit with the fact that it's a choice you're continuing to make. But it is a choice, a constrained one maybe, a rational one given the context you learned it in, but still a choice. And the cost of that choice is becoming clearer now. You can feel it when you're in a room full of people and realize that none of them have ever seen you angry. Not really. Not in a way that landed. Not in a way that changed anything. You can feel it when someone thanks you for being so understanding about something that actually hurt you. And you smile and say it's fine, because that's the role. That's what keeps you safe. You can feel it when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning replaying a conversation from 6 months ago, writing the response you should have given, the one that was honest, the one that would have cost you something to say. And you realize that you're spending more energy managing the aftermath of your silence than you ever would have spent just speaking up in the first place. The math has stopped making sense. Here's what doesn't change if nothing changes. You'll keep absorbing what others won't address. You'll keep being the one who bends so that others don't have to. You'll keep telling yourself it's not a big deal, that you're just picking your battles, that this is what maturity looks like. And the gap between who you are in private and who you are in public will keep widening. The relationships where you feel truly seen will become rarer because being seen requires being honest, and being honest requires conflict sometimes. Not manufactured conflict, not drama, but the simple, uncomfortable act of saying, that didn't work for me, or I need something different. And the longer you go about practicing that, the more foreign it feels, until even the thought of it produces anxiety, until you've built an entire life around avoiding the very thing that might make your relationships real. You'll keep waiting for people to notice, to ask, to see that you're not actually fine, that you're just very good at appearing fine. But most people won't notice because you've made it your job to make sure they don't have to. And at some point, maybe not now, maybe years from now, you'll be in a room full of people who care about you and you'll feel completely alone. Because none of them know you. Not really. They know the version of you that never disrupts anything, the one that makes everything easier. And that version is real. It's part of you. But it's not all of you. The rest of you, the part that has needs, opinions, limits, has been kept so quiet for so long that even you have trouble hearing it clearly anymore. There will be moments when this becomes unbearable. When you're sitting across from someone you've known for years and they say something that reveals they have no idea who you actually are. And you can't even be angry about it because you never told them. You never corrected the assumption. You never said, actually, that's not true for me. You just nodded. You smiled. You let them believe the version that was easier. And now the gap is so wide that telling the truth feels like confessing, like you've been lying this whole time. Even though you haven't been lying, you've just been quiet. But the effect is the same. The people closest to you don't actually know you. They know a curated version, the one that doesn't ask for too much, the one that doesn't make things complicated. And you're the one who curated it. You're the one who decided over and over that the real version was too risky to show.
So, the loneliness you feel isn't something being done to you, it's something you're participating in. Not because you're weak, not because you're broken, but because at some point this seemed like the safest way to be loved. Except you're not loved, not fully, because the version of you that's loved is incomplete, and the version of you that's complete is hidden. You thought avoiding conflict would keep you safe, and in some ways it did. It kept you included, it kept you liked, it kept you from being the problem. But it didn't keep you whole. Because wholeness requires that all of you gets to exist, not just the parts that are easy for others to be around. And conflict, real, honest, necessary conflict, is what happens when you stop editing yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for your full presence. The cost of avoiding it isn't just relational, it's not even primarily relational. The cost is that you become a stranger to yourself. You lose track of where you end and where your performance of agreeability begins. You stop being able to trust your own responses because you've overridden them so many times in service of keeping things smooth. And then one day, someone asks you what you want, and the question feels almost violent because you spent so long not asking it yourself that you don't have a reliable answer anymore. That's the cost. Not in dramatic terms, not in a single moment of loss, but in the quiet accumulation of moments where you chose someone else's comfort over your own clarity, where you chose peace over presence, where you chose to be easy rather than honest. And the version of you that results from those choices is functional, capable, often quite liked. But it's not free. You can feel the cost in your body, in the way your chest tightens when someone asks you a direct question, in the way you rehearse conversations that will never happen, in the way you feel exhausted after social interactions that should have been energizing. You can feel it in your relationships, in the way you're surrounded by people and still feel isolated, in the way you're loved for a version of yourself that isn't complete, in the way you long for someone to see you and realize that you've made yourself invisible. You can feel it in your sense of self, in the way you've lost touch with your own preferences, in the way you doubt your own perceptions, in the way you've become a stranger to the parts of you that were deemed unacceptable. And the hardest part is that you can't point to a single moment where this happened. There's no clear villain, no catastrophic event, just 1,000 small choices that seemed reasonable at the time. 1,000 moments where you chose silence, where you chose to let it go, where you chose not to make waves. And now, those 1,000 moments have built something. A life that looks fine from the outside, a version of you that functions well enough. But underneath, there's a cost that never stops accruing, a weight that never fully lifts, a sense that you're living at half volume in a world that demands your full presence. And the question that lingers, the one you can't quite silence anymore, is this: how much longer are you willing to pay this cost? This pattern didn't appear by accident. It helped you navigate something real, a family system that punished discord, a relationship that couldn't hold your full emotional range, a workplace that rewarded compliance and penalized dissent. So you learned, you adapted, you became someone who didn't cause problems. But the cost didn't disappear just because the situation changed. It shows up quietly in how much energy it takes to get through a normal day, and how rarely you feel fully relaxed around people who supposedly know you, and how often you rehearse conversations that never happen, and the tightness in your chest when someone asks what you actually think. You don't have to decide anything tonight. You don't have to suddenly become someone who thrives on confrontation. You don't have to announce a new way of being.
But if you're recognizing something in this, if there's a specific moment or relationship where this pattern is suddenly more visible than it was 20 minutes ago, you can leave it below. Not an explanation, not a story, just one sentence about where you've noticed this cost in your own life. And even if you say nothing, the recognition will keep working. Whenever you're ready to keep observing, you know where to find this space.